Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Chessie Baldwin. As some of you will know, Chessie is our colleague at Tghat, and she's a researcher at the University of Reading, the United Kingdom. Her research focuses on the experience of Tigrayan women in relation to war, and she's on her way to defend her PhD thesis on that subject. And she has joined me today to talk about some of the issues that she discusses in her thesis and her own experience in relation to Tigray. So welcome, Chessie.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice to be back.
It's my pleasure. So Chessie just returned from Tigray. Maybe we should begin with you telling us what your Tigray visit was like, what you saw, what you observed, what you expected, and all those things. And we'll go into the thesis points.
Yeah, so I got back last week from just over a week in Tigray, which was wonderful. It was a very cathartic visit for me because I started my PhD research in October 2020. So I was initially, I'm not sure if I ever told you this, I was initially supposed to research women who had fought in the war with the Derg. That was my background, looking at female combatants. I previously have researched women combatants in other areas in Europe and in Africa, like Sierra Leone. So that's where I was approaching my PhD from, was to look at those women's stories and tell that story. So when I started the research in October 2020, I had grand plans to go to Tigray a lot and spend a lot of time there, learn as much Tigrayan as I could. And so when the war began, obviously things changed for everyone. They changed my research plans substantially as well. And I think, to make the most of the situation, it made my research a lot more meaningful. It pushed me as an academic with what I was doing to make that research do justice to the people who needed that story to be told, not just because it was a valuable story from a research perspective, but because it was a valuable story from, a moral perspective and a world perspective, to have these women's stories be foregrounded and be highlighted. So it didn't get to go really at all during the research stage of my PhD because of the war, because of the communications blackout. So a lot of the focus that I was forced to take and had to be a bit creative with what I did was digital interviews with Diaspora, and then where possible interviews with women in Tigray when the connections returned through Zoom, WhatsApp, Telegram, and some fantastic interviews done by research team in Sudan with women living in Imrakupa as well. But for me to actually go and spend time in Tigray, that wasn't something that I was able to do until just this past month. So it was really, really valuable for me to go, sadly at the end really of when the research was done, but to be able to spend time with the participants that I'd interviewed online, to see, we went to the Monument Museum, which I'd written about a lot in my thesis. That was very stark for me as an academic because I knew it had been destroyed. I'd seen the pictures that we'd all seen of the Eritrean troops and what they'd done on the inside, but until you're actually standing in that museum and you see the pile of ashes from where they burnt the books, and you see the shards of glass in that corner over there from when they destroyed the pictures and the other, fantastic items that had previously been in that museum. And really most brutal of all was to see the chairs that have been kind of cordoned off for people to look at, but kept apart of where they tortured people. And they had electrical wires and they had remnants of women's underwear. To stand before that with the graffiti on the walls and with the remnants of their presence still kind of very much viscerally there with you was really, really stark and really kind of hit me hard. Something that you kind of expect. And I thought I knew what it would be like, but until you stood there, you really don't. So that was, that was a lot to process, but really wonderful to speak with the people at the museum who are kind of going through this process of deciding what to preserve from the Eritrean presence there, like the graffiti, how much of that are they going to keep to kind of memorialize what's happened, and versus, what should the process of that purpose of that museum be now? So interesting to kind of see how the people who work there, the archivists, are deciding which direction to go in. And I hope that some of the interviews that I conducted will be deposited there and can be part of that process of rebuilding an archive of Tigrayan before Tigrayan. So that was one of the things that we did. I traveled with my very close friend Rita Kasai and Dr. Dawit to Tghat, where they are working with survivors of sexual violence, predominantly from Irob, who, as you know, are still largely under occupation. So we went to the one-stop centre for sexual violence survivors in Tghat, and we spoke with someone called Sister Casa, who's providing wellness and health support for women. And in the day that we were there, she showed us the stack of files that she had just from that week, and there were 19 women who'd come to her just in 1 week from remote areas who are still being raped, who are still experiencing sexual violence to this day, even though peace is official and war is over, but it's not for the lives of so many people who still live under occupation. So Sister Casa and Rita and Dawit are these incredible people doing an awful lot of labor themselves, often without funding and without support, as much as they can with the resources that they have available to them. But the stark reality is the war is not done. And that is glaringly obvious, the further that you travel outside of Mekelle, and even in Mekelle itself, there's still very clear signs of the war and the recovery that's going on. So yeah, it was a really wonderful trip. I got certainly a lot from it. It was wonderful to be there and to meet with some of the participants who had generously spoken to me over the years, and actually, sit down and have coffee with them. And we met with some survivors that are living in an IDP centre on the outskirts of Mekelle, that some of them have been former combatants themselves. So to be able to hear their stories and engage with them was wonderful, but a stark reality of, all the work that still needs to be done, and a real wake-up call, to see the presence of NGOs in Mekelle and the work that they're doing that is predominantly in the same place with the same people, rather than actually engaging with the local infrastructure that there is and the needs that there are in more remote areas, and the kind of the limited impact that those particularly Western NGOs are actually having, was quite a stark wake-up call for me as well, compared to the work that's being done by people like Rita and Dawit and Sister Casa, who are doing it, mostly off their own backs and with what they've got. So that, I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry, I realized I went off on a little bit of a long tangent there, but yeah, a really wonderful visit, wonderful to go. I hope to go back soon, and hope to be able to continue the research that this thesis was really only the beginning of.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that your visit gave you insights that will inevitably enrich you as a researcher, and it's good that you went out of Mekelle to Tghat, because the picture you get from Mekelle is completely different from the picture that you get as soon as you venture out of Mekelle into Tghat and those remote villages. But your account of what you saw at the Memorial Museum reminds me of one aspect of the Tigray War that I think many people don't realize, which is that what you see sort of outwardly is completely different what you see when you go into buildings, and when you speak to people, you see the actual damage of the war inside, not just inside buildings, but also inside people's stories. So I was in Tigray before you. Unfortunately, it's a pity that we didn't meet in Mekelle. And one of the striking things about the whole thing is that as soon as we landed in Mekelle, we didn't see anything that told us that there was war only a couple of months ago, because there was no building that was damaged from outside. But when you go from inside, you see the insidious nature of the war. Is that something you noticed as well in terms of your general observation?
Yeah, it very much so. And what was interesting for me when you talk about the kind of the inside of people's lives is that is only something that you really start to address kind of the more you interact with people, and people are, we're having dinners, we're going out for drinks, we're having coffee, but every single person that you speak to has their own very intimate, very consuming story of what they went through and where they were and who they lost, and that is something that people are carrying with them every single day, but on the surface living, very functional, normal lives as far as possible. But that is something that hasn't left them. And if anything, it's kind of sat on their shoulder waiting and coming out in various ways as people, experience trauma in different ways and process, what they've been through. But one of the things that really stuck with me from the interviews that we did with sexual violence survivors who are living in an IDP camp outside Mekelle is when we talked about justice. And I think a lot in digital discourse when we're online, and especially kind of in this part of the Western world, when we talk about justice and reconciliation and what that means something very different, I think, to me and possibly to you than it does to them. And that was really interesting to hear their perspective on what justice feels like, what it looks like, what they really want. And that is, they want to return home. They want to go back to Western Tigray. They want to go back safely. They want to go back without being escorted by Ethiopian troops, which would be an extremely triggering process after what they've been through. They want their oxen to be returned to them. And that to them, they say, is justice, you know? And to confront that reality compared with saying, oh, what about criminal prosecution? What about international humanitarian law? You know, and to confront how meaningful that actually is in practice to the people who have suffered the most, and kind of reorientate, what are we prioritizing? Whose voices are we prioritizing when we advocate? And that's not to say that there shouldn't be criminal justice proceedings, of course there should be, but to actively listen to those voices and what they're asking for and how they're asking for it, I think is something that we should discuss more and more.
Well, so I mean, I said in my introduction that your thesis focuses on women's struggle, and you have been involved in the activism and advocacy for women for the past 3 years. So you were on the one hand doing research, but on the other hand doing activism as well. And I presume that the discrepancy that we're talking about in terms of what we see from here and what you actually find in Tigray would apply to women's stories and how they are told as well, I would presume. And what are some of the things that you learned when you landed in Tigray, and when it's after you spoke to women and to people, that made you say, I didn't quite get this when I was in London?
Well, interesting you should say that. Is one of the things that I really want to talk about with my examiners when I do my PhD thesis, and possibly at some point turn it into a book. The research that would need to happen for that thesis to become a book, for it to become impactful in any way, is that there are so many stories of women who are not English speaking, who have no access to online resources, that even though I thought when I wrote this research, my intention was to access, I call them peripherized voices, so non-elite, non-exceptional, everyday lived experiences. And that was something that was really important to me, because a lot of the stories of women that get told are these exceptional elites, remarkable individuals that are really held up as like examples of something phenomenal and fantastic. And look at this woman, and if she did it, it's quite token, you know what I mean? Like, she did it, so therefore that's our box tick of, you know, women's involvement. And it was really important to me in the thesis to access the everyday lived experiences of women. And it was something that I prioritized throughout. But because of the war, because of the communication blackout, predominantly I spoke with English-speaking women who have access to these online spaces. And I acknowledge that in the thesis, and I talk about, you know, avenues for that in the future. But actually, when I was in Tigray and I spoke with women who only speak Tigrayan and who do not have phones and they do not have internet service, the perspectives that are gained from really hearing their stories, and they are the many, you know what I mean? They are the stories that are the masses that are still untold, even in this research that I was very, very proud of, that I thought had begun to touch the surface of those stories. And actually, not so much in Mekelle, but definitely the further out we go. And Rita was kind enough to introduce me to her family, one of whom was a combatant herself, and we had a long conversation. But understanding, you know, that for this research to be meaningful, it really, really needs to be done in the most remote areas, in not just Tigrinya, but in the other languages as well, like in Saho, to access, you know, the stories from Irob that are still being completely overshadowed and overlooked. So that's something that I would look to do as I move forward, not just exclusively me, but you know, working with other researchers as well who have those language skills, who are able to access those regions, to make this research that I wanted to access the majority of women's experience, actually be able to do that in a way that is meaningful and impactful.
So yeah. So one of the I think it's a fact that women's stories are generally either omitted or ignored deliberately, or when they are told, they are not told in the right way. And actually, this goes into the heart of your thesis, which is that you challenge many narratives. But I was struck as I was reading your research. I I found an interview that you did with a woman, and she described the Tigrayan community as matriarchal as opposed to a patriarchal. And you would expect in a matriarchal society, you would expect women to be able, not women, but the society as a society to be able to tell women's story in the most fair way. But of course, you're describing a situation where that is not the case. How do you reconcile that?
So this is really interesting, and I hope that I explain this well enough. But if I don't, please do stop me, because I hope that this is quite nuanced, but it's very interesting when you get to it. So, and this isn't just exclusive to Tigray, I would say as well. But let's use the Tigray case to unpack this. Is that in times of peace, where order is very easy, things are stable, it's very easy to return to gender hierarchies that are quite familiar. Where you have women in domestic spaces and in the private sphere and doing the emotional labor and the cultural labor, and men in a slightly different space, doing political work and doing masculine coded fields. And that's where we would use the word patriarchy, the privileging of masculinity and traits associated with masculinity. And that's something that's very typical of a peace stable situation. But when you enter into instability and war and violence, that turns on its head and it gets complete. Anything can happen, anything goes. And what happened in Tigray, but happens generally in wars elsewhere in the world, is that war opens up this space for change and for hierarchies to move around. And you have women entering spaces that they haven't previously been welcome in, like in politics, like being violent, being combatants, committing crimes that are typically seen as being unwomanly, and that is something that is not just permitted, but it's also legitimized. And specifically in Tigray, one of my findings was that it's legitimized through this narrative of maternalism, by which I mean it's called like the children of Tigray. It's your responsibility as a mother, not necessarily a biological mother, but a mother in that you are a woman, to protect the children of Tigray, or Tigray as your child. So that narrative of motherhood and maternalism is a way of legitimizing women's participation and presence in these violent spaces. And not just that, but where you have a lot of women start to participate in politics and activism and advocacy, and really create like a mass presence in these spaces, as we see in this war. Women's presence in advocacy has been so substantial that it's really dominated, especially in the diaspora and in digital online spaces, as being a very female-oriented space. Is that when you start to see some narratives emerge of, oh, this is what a matriarchy is, or this is women's time. And it's not that isn't necessarily the case. It could just be the case for that moment in that time in that way, because it's useful. But what is quite dangerous then happened at the end of the war with the Derg, and I think to a large extent is happening now, is that when stability resumes and when peace comes back, is that those key moments are reversed once again, and you see a re-emergence of gender hierarchies and other hierarchies of wealth and class and all sorts of things that are a lot more familiar. So women who had previously been able to access these spaces are told, thank you very much for your contribution, it was very important, back you go to your domestic space, back you go to what we understand to be a woman's position and a woman's role. So it's not that there wasn't a time when there was more gender equality or matriarchy, depending on what your perspective might be, but more that is a very contextually, spatially specific phenomenon that isn't sustainable and doesn't necessarily carry meaning into the future of what peace looks like, feels like, and can be maintained for women. So when we see the absence of women at the Pretoria Agreement, we see the absence of women in these political discussions. In the meeting last week they had on DDR, on demobilization, 2 women in a room full of 30 men. It starts to raise these red flags of what happened to the gender equality and the discussions of women's rights and women's roles that we were having in the war, and how does that manifest here today?
Well, I think that's Chessie, that's a fascinating nuanced point. I think it goes to show the essence of the advantage of doing research, is that you you see these very, very nuanced points. So thank you for that. And if you could explore this for a little while, Chessie, one of the, you could say, myths or popular belief in Tigray is that the 17-year struggle of the TPLF had an egalitarian element, in the sense that there wasn't a distinction between roles that men and women took. Any role that men took, women took as well. And even you yourself say in the thesis that when they entered Addis Ababa and when normalcy returned, women were pushed back into the traditionally women roles, and the sense of egalitarianism didn't really continue. And I've always wondered why is it that they were not able to sustain the culture, the egalitarian culture, the sort of the fair culture that they had managed to create when they were in the bushes?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and I think there's kind of two elements to it. And the first one is why they weren't able to sustain it kind of afterwards, as you mentioned, because there was, definitely this move, especially in those early years by the TPLF, to raise the rights for women in all sorts of spaces, not just in equal roles in the war, but also, raising the minimum age for marriage, allowing women to plough land for the first time. Those were kind of hallmark moments, really, for TPLF policy in those early years. And especially though the ploughing land was reversed later on, and why those weren't sustainable, I think it really comes down to how useful they are and how necessary they are at different times in the war. When you want to recruit a strong female presence, then those are the kinds of things that you'll really seek at. When you no longer need that many women to be involved, and in fact you want to return to the stability that you had pre-war and those quite fixed hierarchies of gender roles, then that's something that is not just in Tigray, but elsewhere in the world as well. It's something that's quite historically common, because it's very useful to have fixed hierarchies in order to create the stability. But one of the things that I really get into in my thesis is the fact that women in the Tigrayan space are forced, I say, either to the center or they're forced to the periphery. And by that I mean that they can either be exceptional, strong, brave, impressive, they're quite masculine coded, often, with their short hair and their dress, but they're held up as this quite incredible center. It's quite small. Or they can return to domestic femininity, they can mask their experiences in the war, they can mask who they were, what they did, where they went, and return to life that's a lot more familiar and a lot more safe. And those extremes are often false, they're quite artificial. But what they do is quite carefully mask the fact that you have a few token women occupying a loud, visible space, and the majority who do not get that opportunity for self-expression and for nuance and to own their experiences as well. So I think that's a really important distinction, is to say that just because there are some women who occupy that visible space, that doesn't apply to women as a gendered cultural category. But the other thing that I also challenge in the thesis is the narrative of how egalitarian it was. And that really comes through, interestingly, I think, in individual memory of combatants themselves, female combatants from the war with the Derg, who will say, men and women were equal, we fought in the same spaces, we fought, side by side, we slept side by side, we did the same roles, there was no differentiation. And that's absolutely something that they believe, and that's absolutely something that comes through across different testimonies. But the more that you dig deeper into that, what came through for me, and one of the arguments that I made, is that their performances were very masculine coded. They were, in their own words, to quote some of my interviewees, acting as a man. So yes, while they were in many ways equal in their roles, in their respect, in their capacity, it was because they were doing so in a performance of man. So they were doing it pretending, if you will, to be a woman as a man, rather than being a woman in a female space. And that's where you see a greater numbers of women in roles of education, in those different spaces that were not quite so frontline, that egalitarian presence slips a little bit. And you start to see the nuance in what is genuinely equal gender roles, if you have a woman performing as a man, versus what happens when you have greater expressions of femininity and those roles start to become slightly wider. So again, it's quite a nuanced thing to challenge, and it's not unique to Tigray. I'm not saying that this is something that just happens in this space either, but it's really interesting from a from a research perspective to unpack those female roles in those very masculine dominated spaces and how far those women are being their authentic female selves versus how far they are presenting as men to move within that masculinized militarized hierarchy.
And presumably women were forced to act as a man, because if they were to act as who they are as a woman, the contribution wouldn't be as much valued. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yes, I really think that it is. And in fact, what came out in quite a few of the interviews is that a lot of women would say, oh, the only time they realized that we were women was when we had a period, was when we had, you know, our monthly menstrual cycle, which I think is very interesting because it's almost as if they're masking their femininity in these spaces. They are integrating themselves so completely that there are no frequent kind of femininity differentiation markers, except when you have this menstrual cycle for women that was supposed to mean in the war with the desert they didn't fight on the front lines in the same way. But for a lot of women, they would pretend that they didn't, or they would, you know, take additional measures to make sure they didn't have those kind of cycles, so that they didn't have to have that point of differentiation. They didn't want to own up to it and set themselves apart in any way. They really wanted to keep that kind of unit ongoing as much as they could.
But then Chessie, you talk about how the diasporic movement, especially for the past 3 years, was dominated by women. Women played an outsized role in terms of organizing, in terms of activism, writing. You mentioned the case of Omna. You mentioned the case of other organizations. And to me, it looks like that there is, if women are free of the hurdles and shackles that exist in Tigray, it looks the diaspora movement shows you what women would naturally be able to do, and not. This wasn't the case of women acting as men. You know, the diaspora movement was women doing women things. If I could put it like that. Is that a fairly accurate understanding on my part?
Yes, definitely. And can I just say that the women acting as men, I don't think applies to the TDF as much as it did to the TPLF, because in that instance, well, we still don't quite know how many women there were in the TDF, but we know that it was quite a substantial number. I think there was more acceptance of kind of women's units and women's groups and women's presentations than there were in the TPLF, which is an interesting kind of distinction that is still emerging as we kind of enter in that post-war period. But no, I think you're absolutely right in that in the diaspora and these kind of online spaces where it has been so female-oriented, it's very explicitly female-oriented. It's very proud in some ways to have this kind of female leadership and this female presence. And one of the things that one of the survivors said when I was in Mekelle in this past week that really stuck with me was she said that someone had told her, you know, if you want any justice, if you want any change, you have to take it for yourself, because nobody's going to give it to you. No UN agency, you know, no government agency is going to come and say, thank you very much, here you go. Anything that you want to change, anything you want to do, you have to absolutely do it for yourself. And I think that's really what has been so incredible to see about the female diaspora presence, is how far women have mobilized at every single level, you know, emotional labor, cultural labor, lobbying, advocacy, all this physical work, menial work in some ways, you know, writing letters, getting people to coordinate and network has been so female oriented. They've really seized that space for themselves that, as I said earlier, does open up in the war and does become a space for opportunity. And what we can only really hope continues to apply in the diaspora is that momentum, that energy, that respect that women have worked so hard to cultivate carries through. It doesn't get lost in this post-war period where, you know, that energy starts to dwindle because things are moving at a slower pace and there's no longer quite such a need for that continued presence. And the worrying signs obviously are there in Tigray itself, as we talked about, with the lack of female presence in peace agreements and demobilization and so on. But, you know, we hope that the increased connectivity and the increased technology means that that incredible female presence that we've seen in the diaspora is able to kind of translate and carry through and continue to be the phenomenal mobilizing force that has been for the last 3 years.
So if I could take you into your thesis, you say in the thesis that one of the one of the findings, so to speak, of the thesis is that it challenged some of the narratives as far as telling the women's stories is concerned. Either mistaken narratives or misguided ones or simplistic ones that lack nuance. What are some of the narratives that you thesis challenge?
So one of the things that I really try to present in one of the core arguments of my thesis is that what it means to fight as a woman in what in academia we would call something like an irregular war, in that it's not, one state army against another state army. It's made up of, a large resistance, civilian traversing roles as combatants or supporting. That's what an irregular war would mean. That what it means to fight as a woman in an irregular war is not easily categorized into combatant, civilian, political role, military role. And actually there is so much labor that is done by women in what I've mentioned as emotional work. So things like supporting fighters, providing food, providing infrastructure, carrying messages, auxiliary work, mobilizing. So lots of stories coming out from women who are in refugee camps, going up to young men and women and mobilizing them to join up and fight. That kind of unsung labor that really supports the viability, success, course of militaries the world over is something I really try to shine a light on in this thesis, and the extent of that emotional labor in Tigray is quite substantial. So often I will interview a woman who has done lots of different roles. She might have been a combatant who was armed and then moved into a non-armed role in education and then has now become an activist or something similar. And she'll often say, you don't want to talk to me, you want to talk to this person who was XYZ exceptional. My story is not interesting. But then will go on to tell me the 17 different ways that she has contributed to not just the Tigray war, but the previous war, in ways that are very overlooked and very unsung. And I really wanted to, in the thesis, to shine a light on how important emotional labor is as war work, and to categorize that as war work. And to extend the view that we as academics and policymakers sometimes take of who contributed to this war and what does that mean in terms of reparations, what does that mean in terms of who gets access to post-war psychological support, post-war justice processes. And these women who are operating in this kind of peripherized space are never going to get access to that until we include them in our purview of who is fighting this war. And so a lot of the narratives, especially from women in diaspora, who never entered a battlefield, were never themselves under physical threat of any shelling, any bombardment, but who very intimately and viscerally identified with fighting the war because they woke up every day and they lived it, breathed it, thought about it, were emotionally affected by it, just as much in a different way as someone who lives in or amongst the battlefield, and it consumes their lives in the same way. And it's not about equating experience and saying yours was worse because you were there and you were actually fine because you were in a diasporic space. So, your experience doesn't count, but more about building solidarities between these kinds of groups and identifying, which experiences do we tell when we tell the story of war. And when you focus too much on one group, which in history we call it great men history, so we focus on the military leaders or the big figures that make the key decisions, when you shine a light on those, you inevitably peripheralize these stories. So this thesis was really about shining a light on those stories for the first time instead.
It's interesting. What I'm about to say may be something that I misunderstood, but one of the things that I learned reading your thesis is that Tigrayan women have broken almost all the glass ceilings that women in other communities face. And in such a community where women have demonstrated that they are capable of doing that stuff that men do, you would think that the struggle for feminism, for equality, or making the case for that would be relatively easier because people have really seen with their own eyes, what women are capable of doing. But then on the other hand, you go to Tigray, you see the community, and you see that the traditional gender roles are conspicuous, so that you could see that. So there does seem to be some sort of disconnect between these two. And I know that you touched on the why, on the nuances, on the things that are holding women in Tigray back together. But if you could say a little bit more about that, like into the why.
The why is a really difficult question. I think there are, as many reasons why in some ways as there are women. But I think critically to understand is that Western feminism, especially white Western feminism, does not really resonate with women in other parts of the world. But with Tigrayan women, they have their own understanding of feminism, and that varies from region to region, from women of different ages. So to kind of call it a feminism would be to do it a disservice in some ways, because it's really different types of feminism. And what comes up a lot is that some women don't like the word feminism because they think that means inequality, whereas what they're striving for is gender equality. They want to say, no, actually, we're all the same. And feminism to them as a word doesn't necessarily account for that need or that want, which I understand. And we've grown up with different kind of backgrounds of feminism and how feminism manifests and what feminism means. And it's really important to make this a sustainable movement for women to access these spaces and to have the agentil capacity that they have earned for themselves, is that their understanding of feminism is the one that they carry forward and is made meaningful for them, rather than taking something that doesn't necessarily fit, like a Western neoliberal maybe model of feminism, and try and apply it in these circumstances. And I think there are some really incredible grassroots feminist organizations, feminist thoughts that are popping up, have already existed, but are kind of gaining momentum in different spaces, and seeing women, especially survivor groups, kind of come together and discuss what it means to be a Tigrayan woman and what kind of access these women need to have. It is really where the energy should be, rather than imposing alternative understandings of feminism. But I think that one of the conversations I had with Rita Kasai when I was out there that really I think deserves possibly more energy and attention is the religious element to it, and the role of religious leaders and church leaders on encouraging women, especially women who have been sexually violated, to come forward and to seek help, and to tell them explicitly that this was not sinful and this was not their fault, because that appears to me to be still quite a prevailing assumption, especially for women in rural areas, that they are still thinking, this happened to me because I sinned, this happened to me, this is my fault, I must carry that burden with me. So for that feminism to really advance into those kind of most remote spaces, the role of religious elders, community elders, in taking that responsibility to say, from their perspective, this is not a women's burden, and sharing that more equitably amongst the society is what can we as a society do to support women who are going through those processes, to understand, where the blame lies, because it's never been with them, and it's very, very hard to confront for them the fact that that they carry that with them, that they think it is.
Well, you say that people in Tigray and women in particular have a different conception of feminism, and maybe that is one of the reasons why making the case for it is a more harder. So from your experience, again, from speaking to women in Tigray, from the conversations that you will have had there, would you say that maybe it is wise to find a vocabulary that people in Tigray could relate to when we speak about feminism and equality and fairness? Do you think that is one of the things that should happen?
Definitely. And I also think that one of the initiatives that I know, Rita, that we've spoken about a lot is really keen on doing, which I think would be really valuable, is finding a way to coordinate the different feminist groups, the different discussions and ideas that are emerging and gaining momentum in different areas, and try and find a way to coordinate them. So there is a greater solidarity, kind of more understanding of which feminist groups are advocating for what in different areas, and be able to kind of coordinate those efforts into something that is a little bit more unified, a little bit more organized, and able to therefore reach more people and have a greater impact than isolated groups doing similar work, but with slightly different agendas and different approaches in the same areas. So that identifying what feminism means for women, I think is something that they're naturally doing for themselves. But coordinating that and mobilizing that into something that is more easily accessible is definitely something that I think would be really valuable to translate that into like a long-term sustainable movement for sure.
Also, you say that there is a tendency in Tigray among women to self-blame for things that were done to them, including rape. And this is something that I have observed, even on social media. There are people who are trying to help women heal from the trauma of having been raped. And they do from time to time post pictures of women, and invariably the women face masks. Apparently they don't want to be seen, and there is an acknowledgement on the part of the people who are trying to help the healing that is how it should be. That it's all right for them to cover their faces, to be hidden, to be ashamed of it. First of all, is that something that you sense as well? If I don't know if by any chance you went into those places, and second, how do you think we could change that sense of shame?
It's such a difficult one because it is so kind of socially, structurally ingrained. So I think it would be really valuable, firstly, to have Orthodox leaders, Catholic leaders coordinate a message from the top, and that women, can access and hear that this is the official, if you like, religious perspective on this, that this is not this is not women's fault, this is not a sin, this is something that has happened to you that is awful, but that you deserve help for and that you deserve support for, and not a blame. So I think coordinated message across Orthodox, Christian, Muslim, if that is possible, then I think that would be really valuable. But beyond that, it's such a social, structurally ingrained problem that in other parts of the world where this kind of thing has happened, it is really difficult to address women's kind of long-term trauma and the kind of impacts that it has for generations to come, unless it's something that is very socially agreed on, that men take responsibility for as well, for saying, I realize that this has happened to you, I still want to marry you, I'm not going to divorce you, which is something that is happening. Some of the women that we spoke with are saying, my husband has left me because this has happened to me and he doesn't want to be with me anymore, because he thinks that it's my fault. So it's not even just the religious side of things as much as it's the social, economic side of things as well. So unless it is a really kind of socially community-oriented movement where everybody takes responsibility for it, the burden is going to be increasingly put on the shoulders of the women, who will therefore not be inclined to come forward and not be inclined to access the help that they need, physical and social and psychological well-being help, because they are ashamed and they feel like they'll be stigmatized if they do. So it's a really, really difficult one to address, and there is no quick fix, because every approach to it has got to be kind of designed for the region in which it takes place. So an approach that works really well in, say, Mekelle isn't going to work quite the same in a more remote area of Western Tigray that's still occupied and is still ongoing. So it's not an easy one really to address, but to take everybody to say it's a male's responsibility as much as it is a female survivor's, I think is a really valuable way to kind of redistribute the weight of who is carrying this, and who needs to take responsibility for moving forward as well.
I'm reminded of a story in one of the articles that you have written. It could well be in the thesis. It's a story of a Tigrayan woman in the diaspora that you interviewed, and she says that since the war, after reading stories of rape and gang rape and those horrors, she herself developed a sort of revulsion, a cold feeling towards sex. She doesn't want to have sex even with her own husband, with a man that she loves, and that shows you the transcendent nature of the pain. And if a woman in the diaspora, I think either in the US, in the UK, could feel that towards sex with her own husband, I can't even begin to imagine how the women in Tigray who experienced it must be feeling now in terms of the pain.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of that story that you mentioned is one of the key arguments that I try and present of how this woman, who has never been under any kind of physical threat, but has so intimately identified with the collective threat that this violence has posed, because it was so indiscriminate against Tigrayan women of all ages or regions, that she very much identified that this may have been me, this is me in some ways as a Tigrayan woman, whether it's been physically inflicted on her body or not. She identified with that she is, so consumed by the war that she, I think, deserves to be considered a participant within it, whether she was on the battlefield or not. But when you look at kind of the psychosocial trauma that women carry with them from this kind of sexual violence, it isn't just physical survivors, and that's naturally and very justifiably where our focus often is, on the immediate health needs of women who have been directly raped. But there's also quite a substantial healing process, I think, that needs to be considered for women and men who were not directly raped, but who still feel implicated in that process through the vulnerabilities that they were, whether they were afraid that would happen, whether they ever came close to that happening, whether they're triggered seeing someone in uniform, whether they're triggered by certain sounds. That's going to be a social healing process that applies much more broadly. And while a natural focus on women who are direct survivors is necessary for the obvious reasons, there are still so many stories of women who ingrained feel that is going to be a long-term, longitudinal kind of social healing process that may well affect things like birth rates, marriage rates, divorce rates, because that's an unsung element of the legacies of this war, is how it implicates kind of the psychosocial fabric. And that's what it intended to do. That's why this violence was used in the first place. That's why this weapon was selected as a weapon of war, because it does implicate those social fabrics long-term in a way that using a drone or an artillery strike doesn't do. That's why it's so effective. And that's why it continues to be used in conflicts, even though everybody promises that it never will be again. But it is extremely effective at what it does, which is breaking down social fabrics and ruining long-term rehabilitation and connections and social structures.
And you say that the linear storytelling, and you'll tell us what linear storytelling is, that is generally adopted when people write about Tigrayan women's stories, is not capable of capturing this sorts of complexities. That is one of the points you make, and I'm going to ask you what your advice would be to Tigrayan women or Tigrayan men, it doesn't matter now, who are trying to tell the stories of Tigrayan women. What would you say they should take into account? What are the lessons that Tigrayan should learn from the past in terms of their storytelling? But what is the linear storytelling that you take exception to in the thesis?
What I take exception to, and I think applies to this war kind of now more than ever, is that their story has to be exceptional to merit being told, especially for women. You have to have been right at the front line, doing the most, involved in all these political spaces to have your story told. And that's what I really try to address in the thesis, is every single story has so much depth and richness and nuance to it, and tells us so much about the history of Tigray, but is hidden in these women who are living on the periphery and not having that habit of self-expression. So my advice, if I can give any, which I'm not qualified to do, is to encourage that habit of self-expression and to increase those solidarities by saying your story doesn't have to be extreme or exceptional to deserve a seat at the table. And especially for building solidarities of women who are recovering from sexual violence directly or indirectly, or any other kind of violence that's gender-based or not, is to say that your experience is valid and deserves to be heard, whether it is the worst. And you don't have to say, oh, because hers was so much worse than mine, I can't say mine, I don't deserve to seek the help that I need or the support that I need. It absolutely is. And only the more that we encourage this habit of self-expression and discussing these stories, can we really start to build up a more kind of holistic, comprehensive tapestry of all the lives that have been indelibly touched forever by this war, and what recovery would mean more holistically by grouping those stories rather than focusing on the extreme critical cases one at a time.
So, yeah, but again, in the light of some of the arguments that your thesis makes in terms of storytelling, what would you advise young writers or storytellers now about how they should tell the Tigrayan women's story?
The only advice I can give in that regard is that those stories are there. It's not so much about discovery, I say, as about recovery. They exist, they're waiting to be heard, but accessing them is what needs more attention and resources. So they are there, they are ready, they are waiting. They might need some encouragement and some drawing out, but those stories exist, you know, in all sorts of spaces that we would not necessarily look to find your history, but there they are, in memories and songs, in art, in writings, in material culture, in, you know, memorialization. This is where that key history of women's history really lives. It's not in the written record. It's not necessarily in the ABCs of the history books. You know, it is in these alternative spaces and these alternative archives. And to really look to those spaces, to seek them out, and to encourage that habit of self-expression in whatever form that may be. If it's writing, great. If it's singing, great. If it's art, wherever it may be, and to really shine a light on those alternative spaces. If you want to tell a more holistic gendered story, then that's where you would look.
And if you could turn to you, Chessie, in one sense, you are an insider. You have studied the story of Tigrayan women, so you are, you know, you are best placed to tell their stories. But in another sense, you are an outsider in the sense that you were not raised in the Tigrayan culture. And I'm curious to know what kind of vantage point that gives you as a researcher, as an advocate for Tigrayan women's freedom. What sort of advantage does that give you? I presume it gives you a different perspective, I believe.
It's an interesting question. It's one that I address, you know, quite frequently. I think a lot of historians who are white, who are studying the global south, or are studying, you know, cultures that they are not a part of, address, as we need to account for our own positionality and our own perspectives and biases a lot. And the way I kind of approach it in my mind is that I didn't intend to tell this story, but it's the one that needed to be told, and it's the one that it was my kind of honor to have the ability to tell at the time. But there is so much that I can't access because I don't have those linguistic skills. I don't have that same relationship, that cultural archive. You know, this is a Tigrayan women's story, and it belongs to them. You know, it always has. And my role in it is very much, I think, kind of like a microphone, like an amplifier, rather than anything else. And it's really been my privilege to collect these stories, but there are so many more that deserve to be collected that I would love to do, but isn't necessarily within my resources to be able to do. But to make a more coordinated effort to record these stories and to archive women's voices would be a process that I would love to be part of in any stretch. But there is, yeah, so much that I can't access that I wish that I could, but deserves to be sung from the rooftops.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the thesis, and I learned a lot about it. I was challenging myself in terms of what I believed, how I thought the story should be told, and it's always a wonderful feeling for me when I am confronted and challenged in terms of my sense of belief. So it was a wonderful thing to read, and I hope that the thesis would be available in Tigrinya so that it would reach to as many people as possible in Tigray. But one of the things that you, by way of sort of defending yourself, or you write to write the thesis, you say that the fact that you have been involved in advocacy and activism in the Tigray community shouldn't mean that you are not an objective researcher. Could you say a little bit more about that? Why did you feel that people would question your right to do the research?
That is something that comes up a lot in academia, and I know it's been dominated a lot in the discourse on the war. You know, you and I have talked previously about what do we call it, whataboutism, or both sidesism. And in academia it comes up a lot because, especially in history, but also in, you know, political science and other social sciences, there is this expectation of objectivity, which doesn't apply. No scholar is objective. In the sources that you choose to use, you make a decision about which voice is to privilege and which voice is not to privilege. In the books that you read, you make a decision about which authors, you know, opinions you value and which ones you don't, and that is subjective. So when I was writing that, I was very upfront about my activism and my relationships with activist organizations that has informed the access that I've had in the research. But I was very keen to stress that doesn't mean that any contributions that are made in this thesis are in any way biased towards Tigray. And if they are, then that's because they deserve to be, because those voices need to be amplified and that story deserves to be told. And pretending to include, you know, other perspectives that other academics might, be more tempted to do to appear to have a more objective or more equitable approach, I think is disingenuous. Because, as I said, all academics make choices, and whether you're upfront about it or not is really down to the individual academic. And I like to think I'm very upfront about why I've chosen to privilege certain voices. And, feminist memory work, which is basically what this thesis is an activist orientation in and of itself. So it was a very natural progression to have that kind of caveat, is not the word, but to have that kind of disclosure at the beginning of the thesis that this is an activist thesis. And I think, if anything, that is one of the most meaningful things about it.
What are you planning or researching now?
I am trying. I'm applying for funding. I would like to research how violence against women moves from the war front to the home front. And that's a phenomenon that has been documented in other post-war situations, like in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, where violence that's been happening against women, sexually and gender-based violence in the war, becomes domestic violence. It becomes police violence against women. It becomes greater regulation of the female body. And I would like to research that phenomenon in a Tigrayan context, and specifically looking at women from those areas that I wasn't able to access in the thesis, and bring perspectives on how gender-based violence is still conflict-related, even though it's technically happening during peace, and the legacies of war, whether that's male combatants who are returning, who are struggling to reintegrate and are therefore violent towards their partners, or whether that's, as we saw in Ashenda very tragically in 2023, police presence that then targets women in a discriminatory way, because that's the culture that is being legitimized through war and violence. That's the phenomenon that I would really like to research in a Tigrayan context. So we will wait and see if that's something that I'm able to do and receive funding for. But you won't be able to get rid of me even if they don't give me funding for that, because Tigray will always have a piece of my heart, and it's been my honor to write this thesis and to meet the incredible people that I've met throughout the last 4 years.
Well, and are you going to defend the thesis very, very soon? I think you've already Viva in the UK the thesis defense. So best of luck on that. The title is well, I had the privilege of seeing some parts of the draft of the thesis, not in its entirety. So it's titled. Wait, maybe you will remind me. Wayane women, Tigrayan women's lives in war from 1974 to 2022. So this is an account of 50 years of women's struggle of Tigray. Thank you for doing this, for writing this wonderful thesis, Chessie, and thank you very much for your time today. If there is something that you feel like saying, please feel free. Otherwise, that from me.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's been lovely to catch up with it and be part of this lovely Tghat community once again. But yeah, final, I think, thought from me is that I just really want to stress that while it was my honor to tell the story is Tigrayan women's, and it belongs in their hands, and the telling it is their prerogative. And I can't wait to see where else they take it.
Thank you very much, Chessie. Bye-bye.